Awesome. Well, let's jump in as folks are gathering. How wonderful to be together, and welcome, friends, to the beginning for some of us of our series on sustaining practices for perilous times. If you're a member of the Bucknell community, you've been at this for a few weeks. And if you're not, this is our introduction to a brand new series. Delighted to have Stephanie Paulsell with us to kick us off, since it was, in many respects, her offering at Vassar College, which inspired our series. Stephanie, as you probably all know, but I'll say it anyway, is the Susan Shallcross Schwartz Professor of the Practice of Christian Studies at Harvard Divinity and the interim minister, PUC minister in the Memorial Church at Harvard. And it's such a delight to be together, to welcome you together. Our plan is over the next 7 or 8 weeks to invite wonderful people from around the country, from a range of practices and backgrounds, to share a little bit with us about a practice that is sustaining them during these perilous times. There are many streams that have led us to this moment in time, but many of them run through Vassar and Nancy Kramer's work around multi-faith practices, and Stephanie's work there. We had intended to recreate something like the Vassar experience at Bucknell University, where I serve, and instead pivoted really quickly to encourage members of our community to share what practices were sustaining them during the pandemic and during the uprisings more recently. And it was just so lovely that we really wanted to share it with a wider group of folks. So welcome to you. Today, my name's Kurt Nelson, and I'm Chaplain Director of Religious and Spiritual Life at Bucknell University. And I know my good friend Sam Spears, one of our co-sponsors, wants to say a little bit. Also, big thanks to our 2 professional associations of college chaplains, now 1 professional association, I think, officially, Axel. Yes, Maytal, tell me if I get it wrong.
Yes,
And one of our co-sponsors, as well as the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, based out of Brandeis. So thanks to all those folks. And Sam, why don't you say a little bit before we turn it over to Stephanie?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Kurt. I certainly join you in being thrilled that Stephanie can be with us today. And I just wanted to say a tiny bit more. That Kurt's already said it all so well about Stephanie's visit to Vassar, which was part of the multi-faith chaplaincy project on practices that Rabbi Nancy Fuchs Kramer started out of Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. In many ways, we've shaped the whole approach we now take with spiritual programming around what we learned from Stephanie's visit. In particular, she showed us how the turn to practice is one way to move beyond what we often experience as our current stuckness in the religious secular binary that silos religious life from the rest of campus life, cutting us off from the widespread campus interest in sustaining practices from multiple traditions and communities. For that profound insight and many more, we continue to be grateful to Stephanie and are so glad she's with us today.
Awesome. So we're just going to turn it over, and Stephanie Paulsell is going to share with us for a few minutes, and then we will open it up for questions or comments, and we will be done in 20 minutes time. Promise, promise, promise. Okay, Stephanie, over to you.
promises, promises. Okay. It's great to see everybody. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you, Kurt, and thank you, Sam. It's really thrilling to see Maurice Charles here, because Sam and I learned to be ministers at Rockefeller Chapel. So really nice to see you. And Nancy Kramer, who got this whole great program going and invited me to be a part of it. I was really lucky that she did. Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I'm following Ian Oliver, and that's big shoes to fill, so I'll do my best. But my most reliable spiritual practice is reading. And it's the one I've pursued since I was a child, and it's always felt like a spiritual practice to me. It's how I can most reliably get centered, get inside myself, get outside myself, orient myself to the world. I had a very dear colleague at HDS, Ann Monius, who died suddenly last year, great scholar of South Asian religious traditions. And I used to say to her, reading is like, that's my meditation. And she always said to me, you don't know a thing about meditation. And I was thinking about that last week when Ian Oliver said, that he was teaching us the centering prayer practice, and it's about, getting outside of the words, getting beyond the words. And so today is getting inside the words, I think. But the truth is, I've had a hard time reading during this lockdown. I think this lockdown has sort of turned all my spiritual practices upside down. I kind of consider myself someone who needs a lot of solitude, needs a lot of time alone to be able to be present to others. And yet this time alone has been very difficult to navigate. It hasn't exactly been solitude. And, when you're anxious or you're sad or you have too much work to do or too little work to do, it's kind of hard to orient ourselves. And I found the same problem with reading. It's only recently that I've been able to read books cover to cover in this lockdown, but I have been reading a lot of short things and pondering them, and things on solitude. So I think I may be combining these two spiritual practices today, Kurt. Social distance as a spiritual practice and reading as a spiritual practice. There's a great 12th century writer on reading, Guido II, Carthusian monk, who describes reading as, the first rung of the ladder of monks by which you can climb to God. And he talks about taking a text and putting it inside your mouth like a delicious grape and chewing on it until you extract its sweetness, and that gets everything going, the rest of the journey going. And so when we went into lockdown in March, I was in the middle of teaching a course called Contemplative Prayer. And in that course, we read 6 books and then we read them again. And we were just right in the middle. We just finished reading them all, thank goodness, when we went into lockdown. And then we were rereading. And so I didn't reread the whole of any of those books. I just reread parts of them. And because that is kind of how much focus I think I had. And one of the things I read was a little meditation, one-line meditation by Evagrius Ponticus, who's a old desert monk, 4th century, I think, who said, "The monk is the one who is separate from all and in harmony with all." And I loved that because he didn't say the monk is one who is separate from all and yet in harmony with all, or but still in harmony with all. He said, and, as if these two things this was part of our human capacity, that we could do this, that we could hold together being alone and also being deeply in relationship with each other to the point of making harmony with each other. So that really became something to meditate on and chew on, the way that Guido II says. And the other writer who really, I reread bits and pieces of, and who really meant a lot to me in those early days was Howard Thurman, the great minister and theologian at Boston University, at Marsh Chapel, at the many places where he broke ground in everything that he did. Because he talks in his book, Disciplines of the Spirit, he talks about solitude as the place where we could cultivate a kind of contagious spiritual atmosphere, which, he used all these words that were so resonant with the virus, contagion and atmosphere, and all these things we're trying not to spread. He was a good reminder that there are some good things to spread. And he talked about how, for him, it was Jesus's going into solitude, being by himself, that gave him the spiritual atmosphere that he could carry into groups of people and they could feel it. Like, it's why children came to him, he said, or it's why people who were, possessed felt quieter and more settled. It's why people felt forgiven, because he had this spiritual atmosphere that he cultivated in solitude. And although that seemed out of my capacity perhaps to cultivate my own spiritual atmosphere, I was really inspired by that. The other writer who meant a lot to me in those early days and still does now, and has sort of been the Bible of my quarantine, is the queen of social distancing, Emily Dickinson, who, you know, who deliberately socially distanced herself in order to make art at a time when, you know, women needed to just really radically carve out space in order to do that, and she did that. And so what I wanted to do for the rest of my time is to share some of her reflections on solitude in her poetry, because I feel like she gets all the way around it, all the way around this experience that we're all having. You know, and this is one of the hard things I think about this time, is that we are all going through the same thing, and we are going through it all so differently, depending on our circumstances. And she offers a lot of language that I hope maybe will be a little grape for you. You'll find something in this, an image or a line that that you might want to take with you. But my favorite description of Emily Dickinson is by the poet Susan Howe, who describes her as one unchosen American woman, alone at home and choosing. I just think that's one of the great sentences in literature. One unchosen American woman, alone at home and choosing. And one of the things she chose was, she chose not to publish her poems, which I think is another kind of social distancing. She chose not to get married and have a family. She chose very carefully who she was willing to spend her energy on, to the point that people really got angry at her and frustrated with her and hurt by her. But she really used solitude as a practice of reorientation. Some of her poems, it's light. There's some lighthearted dimensions to this. Like in this poem, some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home, with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplus. I just wear my wings. And instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sexton sings. God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of going to heaven at last, I'm going all along. So solitude is heavenly, as everybody else is at church. You can hear them singing in the distance, but she's alone. She's in the yard, she's in the garden, she's at her desk. It's obviously a very positive experience. Then she has some really fierce poems about solitude. The soul selects her own society, then shuts the door to her divine majority, present no more. Unmoved, she notes the chariots pausing at her low gate. Unmoved, an emperor be kneeling upon her mat. I've known her from an ample nation, choose one, then close the valves of her attention like stone. You can see why people got a little hurt by her. She's like, I'll choose the company I want, and that's it. Then I close the door, and I get my art made, I have the room I need to see the connections between things. But she's also really good at the less positive sides of our solitude. There's one famous poem she wrote that starts out like this great, like New England quiet winter day. You can imagine yourself with your cup of tea and your blanket. And then she just turns the tables, as she so often does. There's a certain slant of light winter afternoons that oppresses like the heft of cathedral tunes. Heavenly hurt it gives us. We can find no scar, but internal difference where the meanings are. None may teach it any. 'Tis the seal despair, an imperial affliction sent us of the air. When it comes, the landscape listens. Shadows hold their breath. When it goes, 'tis like the distance on the look of death. She has a lot of poems, as you know, about death, but a lot of poems too about grief. one of the things she writes in her letters toward the end of her life is, the dying has been too great, too much. And that language has really helped me in this time where the dying has been too much, and yet somehow we seem, as a nation, unable to acknowledge it. She also has that famous poem that has the line in it, "This is the hour of lead." And I think during this solitude of this social distance time, I have felt that hour of lead often, and that language really, I've just been so grateful to have a way to describe it. My last Emily Dickinson poem, it's a more mystical side of this solitude. And it goes like this: the soul's superior instants occur to her alone, when friend and earth's occasion have infinite withdrawn, or she herself ascended to too remote a height for lower recognition than her omnipotent. This mortal abolition is seldom, but as fair as apparition subject to autocratic air. Eternity's disclosure to a revering eye of the colossal substance of immortality. Now those last couple of lines, if you go and look this poem up, the soul's superior instance is the first line. This is the canon here, Franklin's collected poems of Emily Dickinson. She collected her poems, she sewed them up in these little packets. She sewed them up with butcher's thread and in these like little notebook paper packets. And she let the variants, all the different ways she might write it, just cascade down the page. So her poems, I think it's one of the reasons she didn't publish them. They weren't really finished. There were always all these possibilities. The line could be this way, or it could be this way, or it could be this way. Well, the line that she chooses for the last stanza, eternity's disclosure, she writes in that packet, to a revering eye, that eternity discloses itself to a revering eye, the eye that is looking at the world with reverence. But for some reason, her editors choose another line, which is to favorites a few, which I just can't stand. It's like eternity might favor you or it might not. So I'll just read that last stanza again because I love it, the way she saved it. Eternity's disclosure to a revering eye of the colossal substance of immortality. Emily's revering eye. I might not be able to read a book all the way through, or, I have not used my solitude to, what is it people have said we should do, discover calculus, like Isaac Newton, write a novel, blah, blah, blah. But I have tried to cultivate a revering eye. And I hope that's what I come out of this quarantine with. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. Beautifully done and deeply appreciated. I love the image of solitude as spiritual practice, layered as you showed it to us, with grief and with distraction and with promise and possibility. I think that's really lovely. I'm curious if you've found any ways to kind of mitigate your difficulties with reading or finishing books. Like, is there anything you're doing to? There were many things that I expected to be able to do during this time.
Yeah.
Right? I have more time with my kids than I usually do, but I'm distracted during much of it. I have more time where I could be, praying, and I'm not doing a great job sort of staying in that. And I'm curious if you found any way to kind of stay in there through reading.
I do think I've read my way back into it. I mean, I think, there are a lot of chaplains on this call, and I think everybody's work increased, right? I mean, that was one kind of unexpected thing, I think, some people lost their work, and that's another, that's also, there have been these extremes in this lockdown. I think, working on reading short things and rereading them has been the thing that has helped me. This class, I have them read these texts once, and then I have them read them again to kind of try to replicate that, the experience of, these books are going to mean different things to you at different times in your life. But, we read them 6 weeks and then 6 weeks, and it didn't always feel, when I teach this class, it doesn't always feel that things have changed that much. This time, we read them once in one world, and we read them again in a completely different world. It was really extraordinary. And Howard Thurman, the book that we were reading was Disciplines of the Spirit, and if you've never read it, it is a great book for this moment.
Thank you. We can open it up for a question or two, and while you do that, I'll post the link to Stephanie's lovely lecture article at Vassar that has led us down this road. And I will note that we will do a special, usually these gatherings will be Wednesdays at this exact time. We will do a special one this coming Monday with Imam Sohaib Sultan and his good colleague Matthew Weiner from Princeton. If you aren't following Sohaib's journey through chemotherapy, he has posted some really lovely thoughts about that. In addition to being just one of the gentlest and kindest and most spiritual souls I think I've ever met in his life, he is also undergoing this aggressive and hopeful treatment right now, and we're just so delighted that he's offered us some of his time on Monday. So be sure to come join us again, and then with Chaz Howard this coming Wednesday, a week from today at this time. Anybody have any other questions or thoughts or comments for Stephanie today?
I think there's a question in the chat.
I see it in the chat. Do you see that one, Stephanie? How would you contrast Emily Dickinson's chosen solitude with our more imposed one?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Her solitude is definitely chosen. I mean, and she's not totally alone. She's taking care of aging parents, sick parents. She's living with her sister. Her brother is conducting his affair in her parlor. There's really actually a lot going on. She's in love with her sister-in-law across the yard. There's a lot going on in her life, but she really chose it, I think, for creativity, for creation. She left behind almost 2,000 poems and lots of letters, and our solitude, it just feels out of control somehow. And I think it's the missing leadership, and even now, like, we're all getting ready for the fall, every campus is doing a different thing. We're kind of, I think, because it's felt like we're on our own. I think Emily Dickinson had an organizing idea about her solitude. And I feel like we're having to just build our bridges to each other. And there's something really rich and wonderful about that. But when you think